Let's bring in CNN political commentator and former Trump White House communications director Alyssa Farah Griffin, CNN senior political analyst John Avlon, and CNN legal analyst Norm Eisen with us as well. Alyssa, what do you think about now that DOJ is looking specifically and asking questions about Donald Trump's conduct?
I think it's a significant development, and I think Mark Short, former Vice President Pence's chief of staff, and Greg Jacob actually sitting down with the grand jury and testifying is a hugely significant step. I've said this before, but Mark Short is basically Pence's eyes and ears. Pence is a studied, practiced politician who does things like have their chief counsel and their chief of staff with them in virtually all meetings. So Mark Short had tremendous visibility into every step of this pressure campaign leading up to January 6th and would be able to speak to that. I think that, and then you pair that with what the Attorney General said, and we could be moving. This is the most confident I've felt, and I'm not the lawyer at the table, that we are moving toward a potential indictment of the former president.
And we'll get to the lawyer at the table. Listen, but while we have you, has the DOJ talked to you?
They've not spoken to me. I am aware of other White House officials who have been reached out to by DOJ and are planning to cooperate.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Can you tell me more about that? Because that was my follow-up question. We know Mark Short, Greg Jacob. We literally don't know a single other person.
I don't want to get ahead of their announcements, but I think you could piece it together based on who's testified before the January 6th committee. Again, these are related but separate track investigations, and I think DOJ is keeping an eye on who's coming before January 6th and who may have helpful information.
But you have knowledge that DOJ is reaching out to some of the people that we have seen who appeared as part of the January 6th committee presentation.
Yes, that's my understanding.
So when you hear Democrats frustrated that DOJ hasn't done enough, hasn't been fast enough, do you share that concern? Or knowing what you know, do you think that actually they're farther ahead?
I think that they're maybe on a bit of a different track. I think there are places that the January 6th committee was probably moving faster and had more information. But I think it's a bit of a myth that DOJ isn't far along in this investigation and isn't doing a wide-reaching and methodical investigation. That said, as somebody who worked in the executive branch and is extremely cautious about DOJ seeming partisan, I think it's incredibly critical that they move quickly before the former president's an announced candidate. Just seeing how the political and media teas are going to fall, tea leaves are going to fall. If he's an announced candidate, I think it's much, much harder to pursue something.
All right. Yeah. Oh, sorry. I didn't mean there was a bit of a digression.
She told us things.
If you can hang on one second, I want to go back. And again, I did not know, and that's new to me, that DOJ is reaching out to other people, including January 6 witnesses. So that is a bit of new news. If we can go back, Norm, to the news that we thought we were going to be talking about this morning, which is asking questions about Donald Trump of these witnesses. What does that signify in terms of where this investigation is in potential jeopardy for Trump and others?
John, I think it signifies a deepening jeopardy. We've talked together on New Day for well over a year now about the prospect that DOJ was going to move. Because if you just look at what's public record, the overwhelming evidence of misconduct by the former president and those around him, the clarity of these laws, the finding by a federal judge in California that there were likely crimes going into the January 6th hearings, conspiracy to defraud the United States and obstruction of an official proceeding in Congress. The Greg Jacob and Mark Short testimony fits into that mosaic perfectly. By themselves, it would be harder to plot the trajectory. But when you connect all the dots, it really points to liability. That is not a guarantee of charges or conviction. And you have to put it together with something else we've discussed a lot, the Georgia investigation, where there's an even faster acceleration. So you see a pincers movement on Donald Trump, and perhaps this will be the occasion in which he cannot dodge criminal liability.
Yeah, look, I mean, people obviously, we do want to pump the brakes for making any assumptions, but people point out that an indictment of an ex-president is unprecedented. So is what he is credibly accused of, which is interfering, trying to overturn an election. So that's appropriate. I think folks who've had a rooting interest in the outcome of an indicted president, which isn't good for the country, let's be clear, I think have been frustrated at times, but they have not appreciated the fact that the DOJ can and should be operating at its own pace beneath the surface of things. There are folks who, Alyssa just made the point, well, gosh, how if Trump declares, will that derail this investigation? We've seen that attempt to play the refs before, and I think that's precisely what the DOJ cannot allow. This needs to be without fear or favor, and that means not having your calculus adjusted by political announcements.
Well, and Merrick Garland is clear he's not going to do that. Donald Trump might mess with that a little bit. If he's looking at these headlines today, this might change his calculus on getting in sooner versus later.
It might, much to, I think, the dismay of Republicans who desperately want him to stay out of the race. Kevin McCarthy in particular, who says he's spoken to Donald Trump about this. Again, I think the key point is we've seen a lot of mistakes made in our culture when people politically get in the heads of people in positions of law enforcement. That can't happen.
But the flip side, John, is on whether it's good or bad for the country. I think it is good for the country after these very difficult Trump years for the rule of law and for normalcy in America to have accountability. And it's good for the world. The world is watching us. Is there a person in the United States who is above the law, or is everyone subject to it?
I think the important point, though, is just people should not be cheering from their respective partisan ramparts about the indictment of an ex-president. Accountability is key for justice and for healing and for reconciliation. But that is a serious moment for the country.
If we can, I want to focus on the new reporting about who is being asked and what they're being asked about, and try to figure out who else they might talk to. Now, listen, this is a different question. If you wanted to get to what was going on in Donald Trump's head and potential criminality there, you've talked to Mark Short and Greg Jacob. Who else might you try to talk to?
Very creative way of asking that.
What I'm talking about is people
just getting started.
People senior to Short.
And it's a very worthy discussion. I don't know that you're going to get much senior to Short unless you're calling in Mark Meadows. But I would say this. I think that a lot of what I perceive DOJ to be focusing on is the pressure campaign and the weaponizing of government and the Department of Justice heading up to January 6th. Obviously, there's the separate track of, obstructing the official proceeding, the violence and all that. But I think really things like the fake elector, this plot to say that the vice president could use powers he couldn't, and communications that could have been had as part of that pressure campaign. So I think you can get a sense of who might have knowledge around that. The former chief of staff is someone who is important in that. Pat Cipollone is someone who's important in that he had visibility on it. But again, we've heard from people, senior, mid-level staffers who've had insight into those things.
So that's what I was getting at. Meadows, Cipollone, Norm. Would DOJ try to get them in? And now Meadows, again, DOJ operates in a different way than, say, Georgia. You're not going to bring someone in or subpoena them if they might be a target, right?
It's very unusual in federal prosecutions. It does happen. The Department of Justice manual has provisions for how you go about it if someone is a target. It's unusual. I doubt that Meadows has been called in yet. Cipollone's in a completely different category. He has knowledge. His executive privilege claims, as somebody who helped administer those claims in a White House, his executive privilege claims are weak. DOJ won't put up with the same kind of bargaining that he did with the January 6th committee. But just looking at the itinerary of witnesses who we've seen testify publicly, Bill Barr is going to have important information. He's a willing participant. We've seen the Trump campaign individuals who appeared before Congress. They are likely to be brought in. And anyone who can establish that Donald Trump knew he had lost the election, he knew there was no legal basis for these phony electors, and yet he attacked nonetheless, culminating in that horrible violence and calling out the vice president. That is the single most unforgivable thing to me, the 224 tweet. Of course. The Capitol's under assault with murderous intent, I believe, Donald Trump. So those witnesses are the ones DOJ is likely calling in.